of Stateside from Michigan Radio. I'm Zoe Clark, and if you are just joining us, we are making it official this week. From now until the November election, on Fridays, we will be spending the entire hour digging into the week's political news. Hundreds and hundreds of candidates are looking for your vote. There are ballot questions that will fundamentally change Michigan and your future. That is not hyperbole. So we decided to use this time to better understand this election and its implications. And we are also looking forward to answering your questions about the November election. You can email us at politics@michiganradio.org or tweet me at Zoe Michigan. That's ZOE Michigan. So for that digging into the politics and that better understanding about what's really going on, let's turn to some smart minds in Michigan here. We've got John Sellek. He served as Director of Communications in the State House of Representatives and Michigan Attorney General's office, as well as the Michigan Director for the Romney presidential campaign. He is now CEO of Harbor Strategic Public Affairs. Hey, John.
Good morning.
And we have Adrian Hemond. He is a former lobbyist in Lansing and was chief of staff for a state House Democratic leader. He is now CEO of Grassroots Midwest. Hey, Adrian.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you here. And also via Zoom, we want to welcome Simon Schuster, politics reporter at MLive. Hey, Simon.
Hey, always a pleasure to be on.
It's great to have you. Okay. So I want to quickly start with what the Michigan Supreme Court did yesterday, or I guess what I should say is what the Michigan Supreme Court made the Board of State Canvassers do yesterday. It wasn't just the Reproductive Freedom for All petition that the court ordered on the November ballot, as we were talking about earlier. It was also a petition that would add voting rights into the state constitution. Simon, can you quickly give us a heads up of what this would do?
Which one? Both?
No, the Promote the Vote 2022.
Promote the Vote 2022 is a ballot proposal that's looking to sort of essentially act as a counter to some of the measures that we've seen other ballot proposals use, such as Secure My Vote. It would establish early voting periods and make it easier for voters to sort of get registered to vote and receive absentee ballots. It basically acts as a preemptive counter against a lot of the ways in which Republican legislators around the country have started to tamp down or attempt to restrict access to the ballot around the country.
So we are going to have reproductive freedom for all on the ballot. We are going to have Promote the Vote 2022 on the ballot. We are also going to have a proposal that would change term limits in Michigan. John Sellek, I want to turn to you. Do you remember ever in Michigan history having this many kind of historical ballots? I mean, that really would fundamentally change so much in Michigan on the line come November?
No, definitely not. And I told a group the other day, we used to have that saying, if you didn't like the weather in Michigan, just wait a couple minutes. And here, if you don't like what we're talking about in politics, wait a couple more minutes and something else big will happen. Some other shoe will drop. And that's what's going on here. And this election seems to have turned for now from what was anticipated to be a giant red wave to a whole bunch of controversy and something that's not quite a red wave. And I think for the public, they're not following the details of everything that went on yesterday, and that's why we're here. What they just want to know is what's on the ballot, and then what they're going to make their decisions on is simply how something got defined. Maybe not all the details are going to make it out there. So how did it get defined right up front? How the Promote the Vote issue gets defined? How the abortion ballot initiative gets defined? At this point, this late in the election, that may decide how it gets done, regardless of what the details actually are.
Adrian, have you seen anything like this in an election year before? I mean, I remember 2012, what we were calling kind of like ballot palooza. I think there was something like 6 questions, but these 3 are heavy.
Yeah, and not in Michigan. I grew up in California, where government by plebiscite is just kind of how they do it. And unfortunately, that's followed me to Michigan, and we're seeing a sort of acceleration of this over time. We referred to 2012 as sort of ballot palooza, and there might not be as many initiatives that are going to appear on the ballot, but it does appear that the two sort of sides in our culture war have decided that this is the most effective way to own the other side, right? is that we're going to put something on the ballot, or we're going to gather signatures to put something on the ballot. And if our side controls the legislature, then we'll dunk it there and we don't have to worry about who the governor is. And if our side doesn't control the legislature, we'll duke it out at the ballot. It's a terrible way to run a railroad, but here we are.
But Simon, we should note it's not like it's crazy super easy to get a constitutional amendment on the on a petition, right? I mean, it takes a lot of coordination, and maybe even more than coordination. It takes a lot of money.
Yeah, no, certainly. But however, I would argue that it is crazy super easy if you have a lot of money. And I think that this is really what we saw with Reproductive Freedom for All. One, they had a lot of money and they spent it gathering oodles and oodles of signatures. And two, they hired the right signature collection firms, so they didn't have to deal with widespread signature collection fraud, which, of course, undid some of our Republican gubernatorial candidates. I think, but Adrian really highlights on something important, which is that these are not like necessarily grassroots, organically funded measures. These things had sort of an external genesis and are externally funded. And although they have a lot of favor within the state of Michigan, it's not like this is homebrew democracy.
John, well, and that's very fair. Right? I mean, let's look at the term limits proposal, for example. Signatures were gathered. That went straight to the legislature instead of having to get this enormous amount of signatures, right? And now it'll go to the voters. But I'm curious about, you were talking earlier about this idea of needing to paint the opposition, right? And that we basically, as I said, have 60 days until the election. So you've done campaigns before. What are these groups who are both for and against these proposals doing right now, strategically thinking? How are they trying to change voters' minds or make sure people who are on their side are getting out to the ballot?
Well, there's kind of a divide between, I'd put two into a category of they're reactionary to bigger picture national things that are going on. The abortion issue is because of what the Supreme Court decided to do. That otherwise wouldn't have been on the ballot. The voting issue, both sides, is because of Trump and what he said about 2020. Whereas what's going on with the term limits issue is people here on the ground who see the need for some kind of reform. They're going to see, hey, maybe it turns out this is the right time to kind of sneak this thing through. We pitch it as something that's going to, punish those rascally politicians, make them expose their bank accounts, cut down on their term limits. But really what it's going to do is help maybe stabilize the legislature and allow people to serve a longer stretch of time in one house, say the Senate or the House, instead of bouncing around and constantly jumping up and down. But because the term limits issue is basically a local quiet reform, it's not funded and it's not backed by a ton of money, whereas the other two issues are national issues, and that's where all that funding comes into play. What we haven't seen here is the response on the abortion issue. They're doing it through earned media. They're doing it through social media. We haven't seen an incredibly well-funded opposition campaign to what the constitutional amendment on reproductive rights is. And I don't think the discussion has fully taken place about what all the details are. We've heard some of the talking points about, will parental consent be eliminated? Will health and welfare of folks that are going to these clinics to get these procedures done, will they be protected as they are now under law? We're not going to have that kind of debate, honestly, because we didn't do it in the legislature and we've only got 2 months to go. And there's only one side so far that has the money to fund their message.
Adrian, what is this going to mean for turnout in November in Michigan?
I've done a lot of polling over the last month in targeted congressional districts, statewide. There is a large problem for Republicans right now in terms of people who were already going to vote. Their support amongst non-college educated white women is collapsing, and that's very bad for Republicans. You think about the former president won non-college educated white women in both 2016 and in 2020. And Republicans are losing them by significant margins right now. That's just the part that's already priced in. The people that we're confident are going to show up to vote because they vote all the time. What would make this go from bad to worse for Republicans is if there is a turnout surge amongst younger women. Younger people in general don't vote. Right? People have to get to be about my age or John's age before they're regular voters. If younger women, by which I mean women, 35 and younger, show up in higher percentages this year because of this abortion ballot initiative, things go from bad to worse for Republicans.
Yeah, and what Adrian's saying is basically the the historical transformation that we've seen with non-college voters moving into the Republican Party, the Michigan House or the Michigan Republicans winning House seats in places like Genesee County, Bay County, hadn't happened since Ronald Reagan days. The abortion issue is undoing that, at least when it comes to women on that front. And then what he's talking about with the increased turnout level at the youth voting level is a whole different ballgame for what we're talking about. But if we go back to just before the leak on Dobbs, Governor Whitmer and the Democrats, she was doing a decent job of righting her ship, but they were basically in a rowboat without an oar. This was not their year. Everything was going badly. The president wasn't able to provide any support. And that is like 50 oars dropped down. Yeah. They grabbed a hold of that issue and they haven't let go, and it's working very well for them.
Well, coming up later in the hour, I want to dig into where the race for governor stands. But quickly, Simon, I do want to ask, now that these three proposals are indeed going to be on the ballot, what are you going to specifically be keeping an eye on, that voters should be keeping an eye on now until November vis-a-vis these questions?
Yeah, I think that the point had been made earlier about defining these issues without having to go into a lot of specifics. Obviously, a lot of money is going to go into that, but I think the battle lines are largely drawn with regards to promote the vote and reproductive freedom for all, where I think that there's a lot more room to budge flexibilities with the financial transparency and term limits proposal. This is a proposal that's a little bit wonky. It's not a straightforward, it doesn't repeal term limits. It doesn't make them necessarily straightforwardly more stringent either. And so I think this is a place where you're going to see advocates have a lot more, probably less money spent than some of these other proposals. But the advocates and critics have a lot more room to sort of shape the minds of voters. So that's going to be interesting to me. And of course, I think that there's a huge financial aspect to here. These ballot proposals, particularly reproductive freedom for all, has the capacity to draw in an enormous amount of money into the state. And I think the more money you see spent here, the more that's going to reshape races up and down the ballot. And so that sort of ripple effect is going to be really fascinating.
And we are going to be keeping an eye on that every single Friday leading up to the election. That is Simon Schuster, reporter at MLive. We are also joined this hour by political strategists Adrian Hemond and John Sellek. And I want to spend a few minutes here and talk about some other news. A new survey in Michigan. It shows that nearly half of Michigan local government officials have experienced harassment or other types of abuse. It's the latest report from the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy at the University of Michigan. It's run by Tom Avaco. I spoke to Tom just quickly yesterday because I wanted to find out just more about the survey and what it means, because it's startling, right? And I just quickly first started asking Tom to just explain what it is the survey found.
Well, the survey found pretty alarming statistics about how the public is interacting with local government officials of all kinds, including the top elected and appointed officials, but also people throughout local governments. What we found is among the top appointed and elected officials themselves in Michigan's counties, cities, townships, and villages, 47%, almost half, say that they themselves have experienced some kind of harassment within the last couple of years just for doing their own jobs.
And what exactly does harassment look like or mean here?
Well, it can be a variety of things. It can be online harassment, so people through Facebook posts attacking local officials. It can be yelling at officials during public meetings. It can be even more threatening things, although that's less common.
Have you ever seen anything like this before in survey results?
This is the first time we've asked the question about harassment. We have been tracking a variety of indicators about how well American democracy is working at the local level. And over the last few years, we've been seeing some indicators getting worse. And so we've tracked things getting worse, but I have to say I'm pretty surprised at the levels of harassment that are out there across the state, large and small types of communities.
Tom, you and I have talked about survey results from the state of Michigan for, more than a decade now. Yeah. And I guess I just sort of love your thoughts overall about what this says about where Michigan is as a state right now, and I guess the country, too.
Very concerning. What we have been most concerned about, it's easy to see what's happening to American politics and American democracy at the national level. And I think most people have seen over the last few years things going off the rails in terms of national politics. You can even see it at the state level. We've all obviously seen the news about the attempted kidnapping of our governor, which is insane. So it's easy to see what's happening at the national and the state level. Less clear what's happening at the local level because we have so many communities and so many local governments. So this report, these findings that half of our jurisdictions at the local level are experiencing harassment from the public, really just for trying to serve the public, is extremely concerning about the state of our democracy today.
Tom Avacco, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Zoe.
Okay, John Sellek, let me quickly turn to you. What do you make of that?
The world's a really angry, cranky place. And then when we mix in technology, specifically social media, backwaters are no longer backwaters. Appointed offices are no longer quiet places to the side where people did their job, but the elected officials carried out their jobs. And I think while anybody serving government is being naive if they think that they shouldn't be held accountable or shouldn't be called out every once in a while, or at least, questioned, that's not what's happening right now. And some of it is actual full-on anger. Some of it is showboating and folks trying to build their own political platform. And it's a weird term to use, but some of these local governments and school boards are kind of like soft targets. You can't show up in Congress and just go nutso in front of Congress or in the Supreme Court. You can't even get in the building, but you can show up at local school board X or local government Y, and the cameras are rolling. You're live streaming it yourself or whatever. And suddenly everyone's taking a lot of grief. And then the end result is us driving talented people out of these jobs, which is a scary thought in the long run, because I think there is a mass exodus going on from the healthcare operations that we saw during the mass mandates and all that kind of stuff, all the way down to city managers and below.
Adrian, we've just got a minute here before we need to take a break, but is this just the new norm, do you think?
Unfortunately, yes. Americans are hungry for political violence, and we see that kind of up and down our political system. Americans are very angry at one another. They do, as John pointed out, have these social media platforms to sort of vent their spleens at one another, and they're starting to translate that into the real world. So they're not just referring to their political enemies as bad people on social media. Now they want to do something about it, and people who are reading their posts want to go do something about it. And that's to say nothing of the hundreds of thousands of deeply mentally disturbed individuals in our country who read that stuff on social media and decide they're going to be the ones to do something about it.
That's right.
We're spending the hour talking about the week in Michigan political news with political strategist Adrian Hemond of Grassroots Midwest and John Sellek of Harbor Strategic Public Affairs and Simon Schuster, reporter at MLive. Still to come, we are going to dig into the race for governor and the money game. Candidates in Michigan are raising millions and millions and millions of dollars. So what does it mean for chances of actually winning? And where is the money actually coming from? That is coming up next after this quick break. But a reminder, we also want to hear from you. We want to answer your questions. You can tweet at Zoe Michigan, that's ZOE Michigan, or email us politics@michiganradio.org. Stay with us. It is a special It's Just Politics edition of Stateside right here on Michigan Radio.
Thanks for listening to Michigan Radio. I'm Rebecca Kruth. Good afternoon. Coming up today on All Things Considered, borrowers who live in a handful of states and qualify for sweeping student loan relief may be in for a bit of a shock. They might have to pay state income taxes on their canceled loans. You'll hear more about that, plus all the latest news. That's on All Things Considered, coming up in 20 minutes.
On the next Fresh Air, we remember NPR international correspondent Ann Garrels, who died Wednesday. She was known for fearless reporting in conflict zones, empathy for the victims of war, and a host of prestigious awards. We'll hear about her experiences in Iraq in 2003, chronicled in her book Naked in Baghdad. Join us.
That's Fresh Air, tonight at 8. Do you have have a long to-do list? Well, take a look at that list. If it includes figuring out to do with that old car that's been sitting in your driveway, how about donating it to Michigan Radio? We'll pick it up for free, and you could get a tax break. We accept cars, trucks, motorcycles, and RVs. Visit michiganradio.org/cars to learn more. In Michigan Radio weather, sunny skies for the rest of the afternoon, temperatures in the low 80s. Tonight, mostly clear, lows in the low to mid 60s. Michigan Radio is Michigan's NPR news leader. It's 3:40.
This is a special It's Just Politics edition of Stateside. I'm Zoe Clark, and Michigan Radio is announcing today that from now until November, every Friday, we will be spending the hour of Stateside digging into the week's political news. We have a huge election coming up. It will shape Michigan's future for years and decades to come. So we hope you'll stay with us and ask our guests over the next 2 months, who are going to be some of the smartest political minds in Michigan, your questions. You can tweet at ZoeMichigan, that's ZOE Michigan, or email us politics@michiganradio.org. So let's get back to reviewing the week that was. We are joined by John Sellek, Republican strategist. He's CEO of Harbor Strategic Public Affairs. Adrian Hemond, Democratic strategist. He's CEO of Grassroots Midwest. And Simon Schuster, politics reporter at MLive. Okay, guys, let's talk money. And Simon, I'm going to read you back to you. Here's what you wrote in MLive late last week. Quote, "The differences on paper are stark. Governor Gretchen Whitmer's campaign held 26 fundraisers in 35 days, has 49 people on its payroll and $14 million in the bank as of August 22nd. Republican nominee Tudor Dixon's reporting 2 paid staff, held no fundraisers, and has about $524,000 in cash as of late August." You go on to note, for every dollar Dixon had to spend at the end of the last filing period, Whitmer had nearly $27. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of sets the stage, the balance that we're seeing financially going into the general election. It sort of evokes that one scene in Lord of the Rings, right, where there's an ongoing battle and you hear a trumpet call, and then it pans to a ridge and a bunch of horsemen come up as the cavalry to sort of save everybody. I think, after the gubernatorial primary finished, we heard that bugle and we looked to the ridge, but no horsemen have appeared. This sort of the forces, national and local, that were sort of supposed to marshal around Tudor Dixon and allow her to really pose and threaten severely Governor Whitmer's candidacy, haven't really appeared yet. It doesn't mean that they're not going to, but we have still been left waiting to understand what kind of attack that she's going to be able to muster against Whitmer.
Adrian and John, I remember, it was last month, we were at a Michigan Radio Issues and Ale together. You guys were the guests. And John, you basically said exactly that. I just feel like I keep quoting you all back to yourselves. But John, you said something like, look, Tudor has to do this right now if she's going to get folks to step up and back her. Has she done that since the primary last month? It's been more than a month.
Yeah, she's not been able to do it. I mean, the numbers are just not there. But this isn't necessarily a surprise. When we look across the country, what Trump has done when he's endorsing people, he's not endorsing establishment generally. He's not endorsing people at big networks. These are outsiders. And if the GOP is going to continue to nominate outsiders who come into a race with no support network, no group of friends, nobody that can help them, they're going to struggle like this. And what you're going to end up seeing instead are super wealthy folks like these tech billionaires that are dropping in $15 million at a time into these U.S. Senate races in super PACs. And we'll start to see candidates, unlike any other time before, spend virtually no money, whereas outside folks through these super PACs are going to fund everything. It's how Tudor Dixon won the primary. There was a super PAC that funded her. She's not run a single broadcast television ad in the primary or the general, and it kind of doesn't look like she's heading toward doing that. So that's going to be the usual for now. Meanwhile, Governor Whitmer was always going to out fundraise and need to do so, and that's because she's not only good at fundraising, but she's not just a state person, she's a national candidate. She made herself that way in part with the help of Donald Trump. When she fought with him during the pandemic, she came out ahead on that. She really raised and elevated herself. So you've got a lot of people from Hollywood all the way to the other side of the country funding her, not only for this time to make sure that she makes it through, but they're placing their bets in case she can run for president.
What do you take away from the money game, Adrian?
Yeah, as it turns out, former Speaker of the House, Tom Leonard, has more cash on hand than the Republican gubernatorial nominee. As you'll recall, he lost at the spring convention to win the endorsement for the Attorney General nomination for the Michigan Republican Party. He has more money than their nominee right now. Elections cost money. She does not have it. And the results of that is that Governor Whitmer was able to define her. I was saying before the primary that, the Dixon campaign needed to come out of the primary roaring, right? They needed to define their candidate for the electorate who did not know who she was. They didn't have the money to do that. And, of course, the governor's campaign did it for them. And now she's the rape and incest lady.
Let's compare this to previous cycles. Simon, you also wrote, quote, Dixon has raised less than $2.4 million overall. By this point in the 2018 election cycle, the Republican nominee at that time, then Attorney General Bill Schuster, had raised $5.7 million. So, I mean, it's pretty stark.
Right. I mean, Tudor Dixon could have also gone for public matching funds, as the former attorney general did in his campaign, and she decided not to, and saying that, it wasn't necessary for their campaign, which is increasingly perplexing given the financial landscape of this race. But again, it's important to note that we're not going to see, what the financial update is for these candidates until just before the election. If something is going to completely pivot, if the landscape is going to completely change, we haven't seen it yet. And I think that really, this is sort of the state of the money in American politics now, is that if you are not an established candidate, if you don't have a well-oiled fundraising infrastructure that can pull in tons of money from you, you're reliant on either the national cavalry to come in, or, as John said, an ultra-wealthy patron who can sort of bolster your candidacy. Really, you need these things on board with you to survive in modern-day politics, and I think that that's sort of to the detriment of our democracy.
I like that term. I'd like to find an ultra-wealthy patron for myself, if anyone's listening.
If anyone's listening, John Sellek, make the check out too. John, why hasn't, as a Republican strategist, let me look to you, why hasn't the Republican cavalry come on board to help out Tudor Dixon?
The national establishment GOP funders, like the Republican Governors Association and others, they're making investments, and they want to know if they're going to have a return on their investment. They're not going to throw good money after bad. And especially as we've seen, the Democrats essentially have a pretty solid summer. Biden's numbers improved. They passed some bills. Nobody knows what's in them, but the media says they kind of accomplished a couple things. And then more importantly, the abortion issue drops in here. When we talk about all this money, for our listeners, we have to make sure that connects to your messaging, because you can have a whole lot of money and still lose. Call Kevin Rinke. It can happen. And so what are they going to be talking about? If the abortion issue hadn't occurred and the Supreme Court hadn't acted, what would Governor Whitmer and the DGA be talking about right now? That's a good question. They're left to be talking about the weaknesses of being in power, which are inflation and the education damage that was done during the pandemic. Interestingly, the governor has chosen not to spend any of her $40 million, $30 million on abortion ads on broadcast. She's targeting those through her digital media to her base to keep them excited. Her newest television ad that came out after the primary, again, is about inflation and education. She's talking about those core issues, while the Democrats come in from Washington and do the blasting on abortion. So she's shoring up what would be perceived all along as the weaknesses of the Democratic Party. She's letting the DC guys do the dirty work. And I would think that we're going to, Adrian, see them keep on that path, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'm watching for is, The Republican Governors Association has clearly cut bait on Michigan because, to John's point, they have way better investment opportunities in other parts of the country.
At this time in 2018, they had run 2 flights of ads for Bill Schuette already.
Exactly right. And so they have way better investment opportunities everywhere across the country. What I'm looking for is, when do the National Democrats stop spending money here? When do they decide that the race is over? And I don't think we're that far away from that point. Absentee ballots are being printed this weekend. They go in the mail before the end of this month. The election is about to begin. 2 weeks from now, if the Tudor-Dixon campaign has not raised a couple $1 million over the span of 2 weeks, everybody's going to stop spending money here except Gretchen Whitmer, because the race will be over.
Wow. Simon, is there a possibility suddenly then that, I mean, in a couple weeks, some of these ads that I think most folks are going to start getting blanketed with might just not happen?
Right. I mean, I think that that's potentially a distinct possibility. I think the Democratic Governors Association reserved an inordinate amount of ad time in excess of $20 million, in part to say, look, we're committed to this race and we're going to fight. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of this is outside of either candidate's control. I think it's important to note that there's been extraordinary little media access for either of these candidates so close to the general election. For myself and my colleagues in the Capitol Press Corps, we have had a extremely difficult time getting either of these candidates to directly converse with us. And I think that that's really representative of how far outside this gubernatorial election their election is going to be decided. It's about these ballot proposals. I think the ideal scenario for Tudor-Dixon would have been is that her race was a referendum on Gretchen Whitmer's first term. Even that would be a difficult campaign. But the fact that there's these other issues, Whitmer is able to kind of keep herself low visibility right now because she doesn't necessarily need to be out there defending her record as much, because she probably believes that her path to the office can just avoid having to address that too much entirely.
That's Simon Schuster, politics reporter at MLive. We are also joined by political strategist John Sellek and Adrian Hemond. John, let me go to you as the Republican on the panel. Where's Tudor-Dixon?
Well, she actually, to her credit, is on social media, so everyone's saying she doesn't exist, but that she's fighting that war there. I mean, frankly, the days where traveling around, going town to town to try to get coverage, just doesn't exist anymore. Most local media doesn't exist, or if it does, it's barely being seen by anybody, so it's not really effective. So we see a lot of stuff on social media, but obviously, while everybody wanted to announce the death of broadcast television as a communications device, digital gets funded, but broadcast is still a really big deal. And like Simon just said, you know, the National Democrats, the last time I looked, they had put $24 million in reservations on the air from the primary to the general. That's most than almost any other gubernatorial campaign itself has ever spent on television ads. So the Democrats do still see the headwinds that they're facing. This abortion issue came out of nowhere for them, and they've grabbed a hold of it and used it for all it's worth politically. But they still are facing a president whose numbers are being trumpeted as improving, but he's still below 50%. And with the people who actually moved into a more positive column for the president are Democrats. His approval rating amongst Democrats nationally was down into the high 70s, which seems like a lot, but it's ridiculously low. It should be in the 90s. So a lot of Democrats started kind of moving back into his category as he got better. So the governor has to pay attention to that. And then there are things that she can't control with the economy. Gas prices go back up again. If there's a terrorist attack and something weird happens, something negative, schools start requiring mask mandates again, all this kind of stuff that's out of her control. Those headwinds are going to kick right back up. So while they may be tempted to have like pounding the Republicans' dividend and spend that money somewhere else, my guess is, at least for now, they're going to kind of hold tight and keep blowing away on Tudor-Dixon.
Does that sound about right, Adrian?
Mostly. I mean, the one thing I will say is this candidate has been AWOL.
Tudor-Dixon.
Other than posting on social media, which is fine. I mean, she's currently involved, like as we're speaking, in a Twitter fight with a state senator, which is maybe not the best use of her time. But it's not clear what else she's doing besides fighting with people on social media who have less statewide name ID than her. What she needs to be spending her time on is raising money, like we talked about. And I do think that her campaign has left a lot of opportunities for free media on the table. She is the nominee of one of the two major American political parties for governor in our state. If she shows up in Alpena, or she shows up in Marquette, or she shows up in Traverse City, she will be on the local news that night. If one of her two paid staff, calls the assignment editor or the news director from one of these local TV stations, they will be happy to put her on camera to talk to their reporter about whatever she'd like to talk about because she's a major party nominee. Her campaign's not doing that, which is frankly malpractice.
I think real quick, and I'm never brief, so I'll really try this time. You have to look at the structure of this goes. This was like a NASCAR race. The governor had like the victorious NASCAR team that had 14 backup cars and 100 pit stops and all the tires and gas they needed. The Dixon campaign was never supposed to be the nominee. We forget already about James Craig. We forget about Perry Johnson and how they were decapitated off the ticket. They had poll numbers. They had money. They had staff. This was somebody who was basically run this little campaign all by herself. And she was boosted by the powers that be at the very end because she was the best of what was left. Then that race ends. The governor already has 4 more cars back on the road the next day because she's the incumbent and she's wisely fundraised and gotten ready. This campaign didn't have any of those things. So the danger usually is that right after you win, you celebrate for a minute and you're like, oh my gosh, we have to rebuild. The whole month of August disappears and you hope that you come back out after Labor Day firing away. And the firing away we're seeing is on social media, not on TV. So
right. I mean, the fact that this campaign has 2 paid staff, as you pointed out at the top of the program, so is that's just shocking to me for a statewide campaign in Michigan at this late date that you would have 2 paid staff.
Well, I want to give credit where credit is due. That is Simon Schuster's
that
word.
That was Simon. As soon as I said that.
I'm going to let Simon jump in. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, they do also have a stable of consultants, to be fair. But I think that, the writing, a good sort of illustration of what, I guess, Tudor Dixon's campaign recognizance of what's going on here is that there's been sort of a tit for tat in regards to debate dates. Whitmer's campaign came out impromptu saying, we've agreed to debates on October 13th and 24th. And Dixon said, wait a minute, we didn't even talk about this. Mm-hmm. These are the debates I'd like to have. And then so they were hoping to negotiate with them. As far as I know, there has been no negotiation between these campaigns and Dixon would really like to have a debate on TV before absentee voters get these ballots. And it seems like that's not going to happen. And last night, Dixon's campaign acquiesced to one of Whitmer's debates, the earlier of the two. And so they will be debating October 13th, well after absentee voting has started. And we don't know whether there's going to be a second debate. And it seems highly unlikely there's going to be an earlier one. So I think that there's a tinge of desperation there.
We only have a minute in the hour, which is just crazy because it has gone by. But, John, it's sounding like, as Simon said, there is going to be a debate in Grand Rapids on October 13th. You have been part of gubernatorial debates before. What, sort of fill me in on what we should be looking for and what are the candidates doing to prep and get ready?
Well, behind the scenes, they're fighting about what the temperature of the studio will be, whether there are labels on the water that say Nestle or not. We've fought and talked about it all. But if you're the winning campaign, you have far less strategic interest in having debates at all. Governor Whitmer knows that she's got to be able to do at least one, and she's settled on a date that's very deep into the election. Strategically, that's important for her because even if she goes in there and completely drops the ball, there's not a lot of time left to use that against her. And so Dixon's argument that with, like Adrian said, that absentee ballots are rolling out of here next week, there's going to be a lot of voting that is done by the time we get to that. And that is the strategy that the governor is undertaking. And from a political one, it's a smart one.
That is John Sellek. He is a Republican strategist. He is the CEO of Harbor Strategic Public Affairs. We are also joined this hour by Adrian Hemond, Democratic strategist. He's CEO of Grassroots Midwest. And joining us on Zoom was Simon Schuster, politics reporter at MLive. Hey, you three, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
So, Election Day is 60 days away, and we will be back here next Friday, rounding up all next week's political news. That is it for the It's Just Politics edition of Stateside Today. I am Zoe Clark. April Baer is back in the chair on Monday. Stateside is a production of Michigan Radio, a broadcasting service of the University of Michigan. Our executive producer is Laura Weber Davis. Thank you so much. have a fabulous weekend.
Good afternoon. This is Michigan Radio. I'm Rebecca Kruth. Coming up next,